So good morning, everybody. I wanted to begin this morning by telling you a little bit about myself and why Matthew asked me to share with you some of the things I've been learning and why I think it's important to think about who we are and who we were as a congregation and an institution. Because I want to grow and learn as much as a church family as we think about a church family that's committed to the goal of radical hospitality in our own time. By the end of this morning's talk, I want us to know a little bit better Trinity's founders and the way they built our congregation, as well as the way, we know that they built and rebuilt our buildings and our church home more generally through the end of the 19th century. Next week, I want to cover the first half of the 20th century. And then, given how much material I have to cover, Matthew kindly gave me a third forum. And I hope that third forum will bring us closer to our own historical moment. I do want to have time to listen to you, and I want each of you to share with each other our thoughts going forward and why it's important to uncover all the things that we might, because in today's world, I think we might be a little bit less proud of the people who were our members. And I want to make clear that I don't want to denigrate these people at all or denigrate the historical actors who gave us our church home, but rather I want to better understand their context in their given historical moment. So who am I? My name is Kimberly Crouch. I'm in my second year on the Vestry, and I do have some training as a historian. And I have to say right now that I am no expert on the history of Portland or the history of Oregon. My own work has been deep in the cultural world of 18th century Britain, though, of course, a lot of my work was focused on the history of women. So I have some understanding of how to consider people in positions outside of power, as well as those within. And in trying to understand the people that were hidden by older history, how they lived in their time and place, and how they created and managed their own power, they were able to carve a space in the world. Given that, a lot of you probably know more about Oregon and Portland than I do. History is never the work of just one or two of us, but working together and sharing our thoughts as we move forward, we will come to a better understanding of who and what Trinity was in its past, but also who and what we are now. Since the murder of George Floyd in May, as you guys know, the Vestry has done a lot of wrestling with thinking about how to demonstrate our acknowledgement of who Trinity was in the past, and acknowledging both at some level our affirmation of things like the peculiar institution of slavery, but also our complicity over the last 150 years and the subjugation, both intentional and unintentional, of people of color throughout our long history. The result, as you know, after much discernment and debate, was the Vestry statement that we published. It really felt very important for us and indeed for the whole congregation to acknowledge in the seminal moment that we're living in, how we felt about everything, or at least the systematic and institutional racism that we certainly have been a part of over the course of our history. As Sir Thomas More said, in a totally different time and place, that silence implies acceptance. And without saying anything at all, we felt like we were kind of missing the moment in a way to illustrate the radical hospitality of who we are and who we want to be going forward. Really, when we look at that statement again, at the Vestry statement, teaching this class, we all tried to think about how we might live in the promise implied and embedded in that statement. Matthew, knowing I was a historian, but failing to know how hopeless I was at managing Zoom, asked me to do a little homework and discover what I could about our racist inheritance. First of all, I want to ask the question, why are we interested in uncovering this uncomfortable history? For myself, I absolutely believe that the stories of our past, especially the fullest history of our past, can continue to impact our present and our future. In the case of an institution like Trinity, or even and especially the Episcopal Church more broadly, I mean, both of those things, I think we are proud of all we have been told. That Trinity was one of the most respected churches in Portland's early history. The Oregonian regularly published news about who was on our vestry, who the rectors were, what happened when someone new was called to minister here, when new buildings were built and added. We've been the spiritual home of a long list of men and women who were influential in the trajectory of the history of Oregon, the transfer of the Oregon Territory to statehood, and really through the end of the 19th century. Of course, in the 20th century, we've continued to count mayors and governors of Oregon and congressmen as Trinitarians. But as a church, I don't think we can be proud of our power and influence without recognizing the more problematic of our policy and the results of those policies in the history of our local community, our state, and in our country. Knowing only what we can be proud of, puts these historical actors as well as Trinity itself on a pedestal. For me, looking for a more complete history, acknowledging both the good ideas and the not necessarily good ideas, and indeed those ideas that in the 21st century we find very problematic, is to understand all of our history. By working to know and acknowledge all of that history gives us humility and keeps us from sanctimony. That broader understanding allows us to move forward in more positive ways. So does anybody have any ideas about, the things that I've just said? Is it right for Trinity to be proud of its power and influence? And why? I mean, I don't know. I know, when I first start thinking about these things, initially I feel sort of defensive. I feel sort of anxious, and I don't know if any of you can sympathize with that, or if you've had your own kind of moments of thinking about, wow, this is something we really need to think about, or something totally opposed to that. So let me know what you think.
I certainly think this is something we need to look at. You said, should we be proud of Trinity in our past? And I think, I don't know, pride, but certainly thankful for the good that we have done historically and that the people did do. But looking also, I think what is so important is to look realistically at where we also failed and where we were blind as people back then. And today, I'm sure we have blind spots that people 200 or 100 years from now are going to see that we're missing. But at least it's very important that we look at them when we do become aware of them. And certainly our unconscious white privilege and racism and just how our church has reflected that is really important for us to look at and hopefully change things within us and within the congregation. So I really thank the vestry for taking the leadership and putting it out there. And it was really a great statement, as other people have said.
So when you think of the Episcopal Church around the period of the Civil War in the 1850s and 60s, and then after the Civil War, what have you been taught about the Episcopal Church at that moment?
I know that all of the churches in the Episcopal Church built before the Emancipation Proclamation were built with slave labor, and that effect has continued, that the fruits of slave labor also filter into that.
Exactly. Anybody else?
I was raised Episcopalian, and Kimberly, when you say confirmation, that brings back memories. And I don't remember any kind of talk whatsoever about the history around the Civil War or any negative history about the Episcopal Church, just positive things. So exactly. I'm glad that we're going to the other side, because we need to see and we need to hear both sides.
First of all, I'd like to thank Keith Walters for sharing something with me that I think is worth reading in this context. And it's a blog. You can find it by looking for a blog called The Crusty Old Dean. And the Crusty Old Dean is a well-known church historian who's taught in seminaries in the United States. But if you look at his most recent blog, he talks a lot about, the history of the Episcopal Church at this time. And one of the things that I know that I was taught was that that we were sort of, yay, the Episcopal Church did not separate over slavery. And we can sort of say, yay, unlike the other Protestant denominations, separating the Presbyterians, the Baptists, the Methodists, all split apart. The reason why the Episcopal Church didn't, and this is what, sort of the darker side, is that while at some level the church didn't technically separate and therefore rose above the petty divisions which broke apart other denominations, in our direct line to God, and perhaps because our leader of leaders was the Archbishop of Canterbury, Episcopalians of the slave and free states did not, in fact, suffer a huge split. But the dark side of that is that the church did not take any stand at all. Even in the contentious period leading up to the Civil War, the General Convention of 1856, if I got the right date, argued that the church had nothing to do with party politics, nothing to do with sectional disputes, with wealth, with splendor, or with the ambition of the world. Now, knowing that the Kansas Territory at this point was being totally destroyed by abolitionists and slaveholders, what are your reactions to that statement as we think about what the church said? The best that the church could do was the church has nothing to do with that, party politics or sectional disputes.
Compared to where we are today, in terms of this melding that has occurred in the last 3 years in state, it's very, very frustrating.
Yeah.
And I suppose I would say that better the church stand apart and still be socially active rather than have an administration take over a supposed preferred or religious aspect, so that apparently the evangelicals are Trump's focus these days. But what do you do with the Jews and Catholics and Islamists and Muslims and so forth in our country right now? So it seems a very interesting juxtaposition of where we are today.
Right, Pam, thank you for that. I know in the chat, someone mentioned that having grown up in Alexandria, his parish talked a lot about what the church did during the Civil War. They were a field hospital for the Confederacy, but never actually thought about what that meant in terms of slavery, which kind of is all a part of the lost causism that we're now learning more and more about. The second sort of truism that I remember hearing in confirmation class was that after the Civil War, the Episcopal Church did get rejoined quite quickly. But at some level, while some of the Southern bishops did go to the General Convention of 1865, most of them did not. But ultimately, the kind of re-stitching together of the Episcopal Church was really at the cost of African Americans who were also Episcopalian, that to bring the white church together, it meant that Black Episcopalians, who many of whom probably left the church right away but it was the church they had gone to as the property of slaveholders. Some stayed, and some wanted to be a part of that larger congregation. But as Anne Weichel points out in her book about, Oregon and Trinity, the early Oregon missions were intended to be totally separate from any mission churches that were established for Native Americans. From the get-go, there was this notion that Native Americans and white people needed a different message from the church. At some level, that's understandable given, education and all the other things, but there was always a sense that the other, whether it was Blacks or Native Americans, were to be separated from the church. And, that I think, as we think about that period of the Civil War, the years around the Civil War, that has much to do with Oregon's foundation as a state. I think at this point, most of us have heard about what the Oregon Constitution said in its quest to become a state of the United States. What are some of the things? I think a lot of this has been in the press a lot recently. So what do y'all know about Oregon's Constitution as it was originally written in 1857?
Didn't it prohibit slavery, but also prohibited African Americans from living in the state?
Exactly. I think that really is it in a nutshell. And I think, of course, the writers of the Constitution really didn't have a sense of what that would mean going forward. And at the time, it's unlikely that many of them had a moral objection to slavery. But in their quest to become a state and to be sympathetic to either themselves and the people around them, the early Oregon settlers, for the most part, had not been slave owners. They were not people of wealth when they moved west, which is one of the reasons why they moved west. The original Oregon settlers really did not want slavery. Many of them had been as farmers, had been in competition with with slaveholders, and therefore, as they developed their own farms and their own property, they really couldn't keep up with people who owned slaves and were able to use that labor without cost. And yet there were others, obviously, who had slaves. In the Constitution, or in the development of the Constitution, as you probably know at this point, that the presider of the Oregon Constitutional Convention was Matthew Deedy, longtime vestry member of Trinity, although he was not in Portland when Trinity was founded. So in threading that needle between whether or not Oregon was to be slave or free, that's the compromise that the Oregon Constitution writers eventually came up with. And we know that many of them had no moral objection to slavery. Certainly Deedy did not. He was kind of affirmed the right of people to own slaves. But I think, in his mind, given the Dred Scott case of a few years before, that, where slaves could be taken without issue from slaves remained property, both in their slave states, but also as they cross state lines. Because of the Dred Scott decision, Deedy really believed that by outlawing slavery, that would be a dead letter law in the Oregon Constitution. But there was a lot of anxiety also about Blacks entering the state. And so that's how they came up with the compromise of disallowing slavery, but also refusing to allow either Indigenous people or Blacks to enter the state if they weren't already there, and prevented them from owning property. We're sort of winding down. Next week, we can talk a little bit more about Deedy, because I think his opinions changed over the course of his life. And I think as like many of us, our opinions sort of change and grow as we learn more and as the society around us changes. But do y'all have any questions about that or any other comments about this work that we're engaged in?
I have a quick comment, Kimberly, which is that, first of all, I just want to acknowledge that, speaking for myself, I've swum my whole life in a racist soup and not known it. So I am learning every day about, as I uncover that for myself. And one of the things that I've come to really think is important is that we don't refer to people who were enslaved as slaves, because that dehumanizes them, so that we refer to them as enslaved people and not as slaves, so that it's clear that some people have taken other people as captive, not that they were something other than people.
Right. Jeffrey, thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I think it is absolutely important, and I will pay closer attention to that going forward. And so thank you. Does anyone else have anything they want to add?
Years ago when Train formed, and we worked on the booklet about the history of Native Americans in Oregon, the one thing that struck me, and I was a complete novice at the time, was there had been indigenous people here at least 10,000 years that we can tell, maybe probably more. And when people came here, I mean, we are not alone worldwide in how people who come to a new country, they didn't see the natives as humans. And I think that it's not a blaming thing. It's the way it was. And that I'm not a historian, but I know that history is really complicated, and that a lot of the people who came here were trying to get away from something and move towards something else. And so, but I also know that from all the work we've done, that we do need to face the truth, and to, as our church is asking us to do, is to look at our baptismal covenant and make sure that we are living by that. And so I really value the work that you're doing. And I'm very excited that there are more people joining those of us who've been working in Train for the last 5 years to uncover the truth.
Thank you, Barbara. I mean, at some level, Train has been the inspiration of some of the things I've been trying to find out about. And I think when we started, we knew a lot of the obvious cast of characters, and we knew what they had done, both that was appropriate for their time and day in terms of founding Trinity and helping Trinity grow in the, kind of explosion of Oregon's population in the 19th century. But it's also important to ask the other things they might have done. So as I said, I think at the beginning, so that we can move forward with that full knowledge. Does anyone have anything else they want to add before we get ready for church?
This is Bob. You gave us a great introduction today and got into Dee Dee a bit, and I can't wait to come back next Sunday and participate in the next segment of your talk, of your class. So thank you.
I should say that I'm doing my work on Bob and Dale's shoulders, because they've done a lot of the groundwork relative to a lot of a lot of thinking about Trinity's history. So thank you all, and I'll see you in church.